All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, welcome to today's broadcast with the University of Alabama. We're going to be talking about behavioral risk threat assessment, as you see on the screen. How do you stop bullying, suicide, and guns before it's too late? And this is the second in the 2017 webinar series with the University of Alabama. And I think we're starting either our fifth or our sixth year together in doing these. You can go on the website and see some of the past webinars and share. It's unfortunate that we're having to talk about the types of subjects that you see on the screen because the impacts are being felt every day, and we can see them on our news each and every day. We'd like you to be our friend at Twitter at Firestorm Soul or on Facebook at Firestorm Solutions. There is a hashtag for today's session. That is hashtag Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value, and we empower you to manage risk and crises. Our expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Firestorm is America's crisis coach, and we really are trying to deal with that intersection of risk and crisis to make a difference. There is a disclaimer today. Our attorneys always want to make sure that we don't overpromise, and it's not complete without the oral discussion. And you have to read this in conjunction with guidance from your local authorities as well as your organization's personal legal counsel. And it should not be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. By the way, I'm an engineer. I'd be a bad attorney. We're really excited about working with the University of Alabama, and you see up on the screen the corporate engagement work that's there. And BAMA at Work is an ongoing series, and we're fortunate to have with us Brenda Truelove again. Brenda, tell me about what's going on over at BAMA.
Well, good morning. It's a rainy morning here on campus, but it's exciting. We're in full swing for the semester, and we are also in full swing for preparing with our corporate engagement partners, our BAMA at Work team. We are trying to engage with corporations and C-level executives and to ask them the question, what keeps you up at night? What pains do you have that you would like us to help you turn into gains? So we are busy setting our schedule for the next 12 to 18 months. We're working with senior team executives, managers, and we are actually working with several local corporations on their succession planning efforts, their leadership development, their talent training, and really trying to help people stay engaged with what's good for their businesses, to look to the future, and to give them the training that they need to stay competitive. We're here to help, and we are very fortunate to have Mr. Satterfield and our Firestorm partners come alongside us to help us develop programming that keeps us on the cutting edge of thought leadership and providing the ideas and the training that's needed to stay competitive in today's really global economy. Dr. Bob Prescott is our corporate engagement division leader, and you can see from his short bio there that he has some great both personal experience in corporations, working for Bell South for many years, but also a business school professor. So if anyone has any questions about what we offer through BAMA at Work, our College of Continuing Studies, my contact information is showing on the screen, and I'm Truelove at ccs.ua.edu or 348-9066 if you're calling from Alabama. So Jim, thank you again for this opportunity. I always learn something new from you every time we do a webinar, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about BeRThA today.
Well, I think it's exciting for everybody on the call to know that the resources at the University of Alabama are available. They're available virtually. They're available on-site at your location. I've been fortunate enough to be invited to participate in the work in cybersecurity, working in business continuity with HR directors, and specifically we've been working on a program that's the title of what we're doing today, Behavioral Risk Threat Assessment. And there's an entire program that's being rolled out, and that will make a difference in the workplace. So if you've got needs, you've got instant access with experienced people at the university that can make a difference in your organization. I'm Jim Satterfield. I'm the president and CEO of Firestorm, and we're going to talk today about behavioral risk assessment and how we stop those things. If you would like to view past webinars, you can go to firestorm.com and you can register for future events that are coming up. By the way, we did a virtual exercise earlier this month in February around the themes that you see listed here, the streaming of video, cyberbullying, sexting, and went through and had hundreds of organizations with their crisis management teams experiencing what it's like to make those decisions. And I would encourage you to watch those in the future if you haven't participated. It gives you a real opportunity. But in coming back today and thinking about that word that's on the screen, crisis, what comes to mind? What are you thinking about that? And I think immediately we all start to think about natural disasters, the hurricanes, the tornadoes, the floods. We think about terrorism and the threats that are associated with it, the cyber breach. But the common theme around all of these is that there are behaviors that cause those concerns. And what we want to do is to be able to identify them. And JFK in his book used the Chinese symbols for crisis, which combine danger and opportunity together to put that in place. And we have to think about both of those as we view this, because there's a critical turning point when we think about a crisis. The future events will be based upon what occurred at that point. So I'd like you to stop for a minute and think about your company. It's represented as one of the dots on the screen. You probably can pick out yours instantly to immediately go, yep, I'm that one right there. And the theme here is the worst disaster you'll ever see is the one that strikes your company. And when it happens, you then you start to stick out as that red dot in the center of the screen. But it's how other people start to view you and how they recognize you within your organization. If I were to say the word Columbine today, most of you would stop and think, well, that was the shooting in Colorado and how horrific it was a number of years ago. You wouldn't be stopping and saying, Columbine is the state flower for Colorado, because these crisis events can define you. If there isn't one there, you can see how suddenly you blend back into the background. You're not standing out and seeing those things coming together, because when that crisis occurs, it's going to suddenly expand and dominate everything around you within your organization. So our goal here is to make sure you're not the one that's affected in that particular way. So where do you start? You've heard us say several times that a crisis is not business as usual, it's business as unusual. And so that makes it difficult to figure out the first things that you need to think about and do. And so it brings us back to lessons learned. And we're going to share with you today how you start to identify behaviors of concern. We're going to think about it in 3 different perspectives. So we'll be going through it 3 times. Hopefully that will start to resonate and help you think about your organization's workplace violence program and what you need to put into place. We'll then also give you a framework to pull that together that can make a significant difference within your organization. So some behavior is very clear. Threats are an example. I think everybody on the call today would get it immediately if they saw violence that was occurring at work, or someone bringing a gun into the workplace, making a threat. Whether it's a direct threat or a veiled threat, yeah, that's pretty serious. That's a threatening behavior. We need to intercede. We need to take some actions. But sometimes those behaviors are not so clear. And you see a long list there on the screen. I'm not going to read all of those, but think about the loner, or the paranoid, or the substance abuse, or domestic violence. We're seeing domestic violence coming to work on a regular basis. By the way, the second leading cause of death of women in the workplace is violence. And so when you view that, that's a concern that we all share. The most important one I want to start to bring to your attention is that word in red at the bottom, toward the bottom of the second column, and that's change. When you see behavior starting to change in someone in your organization, that's an immediate indicator that we need to intervene, that things are starting to happen. Somebody that was always coming to work and now has absenteeism. Someone that was easy to get along with now is argumentative. Someone who used to do a great job and now their quality of their work has shifted. Something's happened. That's an indicator of a behavior of concern. Now, I want to keep the focus here on behavior and not demographics as we talk through this. And you'll see at the bottom in the blue box some personal protective factors, coping skills, interest outside of school or work. Those are the types of things that can make a difference. So this is the first time in our webinar today that we're going to be talking about these. We're going to talk about them 2 more times in a couple of different perspectives. So let's take a step back. What leads us to violence? And as you see the list there on the screen, we put it into 3 different buckets. One is a breakdown of support systems, another is personal factors, and the last are workplace factors. You can start to see of how if the support system around the person is jeopardized, if they're going through a divorce, if they're in financial difficulty, if they personally have substance abuse issues or have some aggressions that you've seen in other ways, or if maybe they're concerned about their job security. Are they going to keep? Is the company being sold? Are we going to have layoffs and cutbacks? As those elements start to come together, it starts someone on this path to violence. So who poses the highest risk? Who poses a threat? Now you'll see a lot of lists on the screen as you go through that. Multiple losses, suicidal, intoxication, pulling out of a grievance process. We were doing a series with a large insurance company specializing in the houses of worship, churches, mosques, and synagogues. And as this was being done, we had 4,000 people. We got a series of phone calls of saying, I've got a person in my congregation that represents every one of the items that you see on the screen. What do we do now? And what we're looking here is starting to build a pattern that you can identify with. So let's start to go back through this a second time from a slightly different perspective. Let's think about red flags. Some of these things that are clear. Comments about suicide, it's never a joke. Those are issues that we have to assume that this person is on a path to violence. Now we have an interesting correlation factor in the school marketplace, and then I'll talk about it in the business. In the school marketplace, if a child is contemplating suicide, there's a 100% correlation to them having a kill list. Here are all the people that I'm going to get even with before I take my own life. Now, we're starting to see the kill list in a work environment on an increasing percentage. So it's not just the person who's thinking about it, it's those people that are around. It's the chance I'm going to get even at this point. Second, intimidating comments. If I'm talking about hurting someone, hitting, striking, I'll run over them if they do that one more time. Those are the types of things that you want to look at. Fits of rage, that person who is just disproportionately responding to the events around them. And you can see them, and in fact, you may be worried about that they'll have a stroke or a heart attack, that they're in such a violent mode. And then destroying property. It's interesting, at the beginning of Firestorm, we were working with a company, and I was attending a safety committee meeting and their plan and location, and the safety committee, 2 members on the team, got into a fist fight in the middle of the safety meeting. That's a little bit of a different point of interest associated with it, but I think none of us would miss these types of behaviors. Let's go back to the ones that maybe aren't quite as clear. Fascination with weapons. Now, in a lot of areas, hunting is a normal interest. People go up and are used to that and looking at it. So just an interest in weapons aren't necessarily a trigger. But if it starts to shift talking about past criminals and about violence, those are certainly raising that element of concern. Depression. Depression is a precursor to some of the areas that we've been seeing, ultimately the suicide. We've seen individuals become so paralyzed with the depression that they can't do their job every day. So it's not just violence when we talk about behaviors of concern, it's productivity, it's the person as a total, as a whole. Substance abuse, drugs, and alcohol. When you hire the American public, you get the American public, good, bad, and indifferent, and those traits are there. And again, we're looking at changes in that pattern. Abuse in the home. Domestic violence has come to work, and most of the domestic violence that we see is at the start or the end of a shift when someone's coming to or leaving work because the spouse knows that they're there at that point. And then finally, changes in behavior, withdrawing. somebody that used to eat lunch with their people at work together, and now they're sitting by themselves. They're not participating. They dropped out of the company softball team. They're not really involved in the other activities that are there. Now we're starting to see a pattern that's building. Now, remember we talked earlier that there were some protective factors, and if you look at those, the more of those things that are there, the less likely that this is going to convert from a behavior of concern into a violent act. But if they don't have these, if these aren't there, then we're starting to see that concern level becoming more real. Well, Jim, that's great. I understand their behaviors of concern. I kind of get the red flags. I understand that, but what do we do about it in our organization? Firestorm over the last 5 years has developed a program called Behavioral Risk Threat Assessment, and it's divided into 4 buckets: awareness training, intelligence network, a central repository, the BeRThA plan, how you actually deal with this information as it comes in. We'll give you a walkthrough of that, and then we'll go back again to the behaviors of concern to help frame how these things come together. The awareness training is exactly what it seems. It's what do you look for? If you see something, say something. How have you trained your employees to recognize that this isn't normally what we're looking for in that area? Now, when we think about the intelligence network, how do we communicate that? Most organizations, you would go to HR and say, I have this concern. You might go to your supervisor, but if your problem is with your supervisor, you clearly aren't going to go there. Many of the organizations we deal with have ethics hotlines that you can call in and do a report. Additionally, there are new products and services available that allow you to do those tips either by a phone call or an anonymous text message. The company that we work with most often in this area is called Tip Now, and you could have an anonymous text where immediately you can get that information into the organization. Additionally, we do create open source intelligence networks where we monitor social media. That's an important tool and an indicator. We had a large client with hundreds of restaurants around the country. They called us on a Wednesday afternoon and said, someone has made an anonymous posting on our corporate Facebook account that they're going to go to a specific restaurant, and they had identified which one, and kill everyone on Friday. We got the call on Wednesday. We got from them because they had seen that posting on Wednesday, and they asked, could we help? Karen Mazzullo, who's on our call with us today, who is our Chief Intelligence Officer, went to work. She was able to identify the person's first name. She was then able to identify his girlfriend's name, his home address, his last name, and then his home address. We called the client back within 2 hours and said, this is the person. It's a 17-year-old boy who worked in your restaurant, who was fired, and was going to go back on Friday to even the score. They turned the information over to the police, who went and met with the family of the young man. I can't imagine that that was a warm, fuzzy kind of a meeting and a lot of concern. While that was going on, Karen set up a geofence around the restaurant to monitor social media traffic in and out, and was able to determine that the manager at that particular restaurant was selling drugs out the back door. So when you think about it, in less than 2 hours, we found the would-be killer and the drug dealer because of the monitoring of the social media channels that were out there. Fortunately now, this is very inexpensive, and you can do in a very cost-effective way to understand. We couldn't have done it 10 years ago. So if you take a look at the anonymous reporting, you add in the social media monitoring, you certainly have a much better understanding of what's going on. You obviously have to have a way to report that information and get it to the right people. You're all doing background checks in your companies. Most everyone is doing federal felony databases, which is certainly a good way to identify. But if you expand beyond that and look at your county courthouse, you can look at the misdemeanors. If someone was arrested for a felony but plea bargained down to a misdemeanor, they wouldn't be in the national database. They'd only be in your county courthouse. Also, if you found out things about DUI or domestic violence that was listed at those levels, those would be things that you'd want to know. By the way, and it's not a once and done. You hire a person and then don't look at them again for years. That's not the most effective way. And in the educational marketplaces, the standard is you do this annually. You update those background checks. The last of in the intelligence network is the key metrics. And those are all the things that you're already doing and thinking about your company. Did this person suddenly start to have an attendance problem? Did the quality of their work make a difference and now it's started to go down? And so you look at those metrics, and those will also be indicators as part of an intelligence network. The central repository comes in with what do we do with all this information? We've got to have a central point. Maybe one supervisor saw something. Maybe someone else saw something. Maybe you got an anonymous tip. Where are you pulling all of those factors together to be able to analyze it? And that's in a central repository. What we see many times is that information gets siloed. Somebody sees something this week, somebody else sees something next week, and no one connects the dots until it's too late and we've led to a violence. And then the notification would then go into either the threat management team or the behavioral management team. That's what the BMT is, or you'll see it on another side listed as a TMT for a threat management team, to be able to look at that information in an organized manner. That organized manner is in the BeRThA plan, the Behavioral Risk Threat Assessment. Someone immediately has to take that tip or that information that comes in and do an initial risk categorization. They need to look at, is this someone that is a normal discipline problem that we'd handle it in a routine manner? Is it something that's urgent? Somebody that's brought a gun to work, somebody that's making specific threats that we need to call the police and get them engaged. And so that would be at that urgent level. The category in the middle, though, is where most organizations have difficulty. That's where we need to do an investigation. We need to do a risk screening and go through a much better analysis of what's happening. And that's where the behavioral management team or the threat management team would do that. They would then do a screening on the risk, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, and be able to make a decision of what they need to do. They would take action, they would have ongoing monitoring, ultimately a sign-off and record keeping. So that's the structure. It's fairly straightforward. Awareness, intelligence, central repository, and then a plan on how you deal with this information. So I want to go back to the behaviors of concern, because that's where all of this starts and all of it comes together. We do a program that we think about as a behavioral snapshot. It's a quick picture of where are they right now. Now you need to link those together over time and see, is the behavior stable? Is it increasing? Is it decreasing? And how it would look at. And then we put it into those puzzle part pieces there, where it says school, think about your workplace and what's going on. And then the protective factors are around it to protect that person. Let's break each one of those areas down. So if we think about that social peer area, someone that holds a grudge, some name calling, abusive language, identification with gangs, those types of areas are suddenly then behaviors that we can see that lead us to think this person may be at risk. Let's talk about the family. Is there abuse? Is there a change in marital status? Child custody issues, multiple loss, the death of a spouse, the death of a family member. Those factors would suddenly begin an initial point of behaviors of concern. Then we move in the physiological area. And I draw your attention to the last two in the second column, because it's interesting. It's either a pattern of under-controlled anger, somebody that just can't control it, they're always yelling, always upset, or a pattern of over-controlled anger, where they're internalizing all of those areas. That's why you have to look at multiple data points as you're identifying each of these areas. The urgent, the ones that we're immediately going to seek help for, the brandishing of a weapon, attempted suicide, violation of protection orders, all of those elements would be ones that we would then be much more concerned about. And then the behavior list. As you think about all these behaviors, we can see some of these elements coming in and impacting our organization. By the way, there is a link to the brief around today's webinar, and so you can look at these lists and get that information in the brief. along with other elements. So we've hit a bunch of the behaviors of concern, but I don't want to lose sight of those protective factors again that are going to be kicking in to make a difference to lower the risk factor associated with that particular individual. So now we've talked a lot today about the behaviors of concern, and we've given you this initial structure. I want to go under the covers and make sure that you're following what we need to do once we see the behaviors of concern. So on the program, when you talk about a violence prevention program, and that's exactly what BeRThA is, here are all the elements that we've already described that you see on the left of your screen. That's the awareness. Everyone needs to be educated. This is a role that HR certainly can take a key lead in, but it's not just an education when someone's hired. It's the regular repeated training throughout the year so that there's an understanding. Well, that's great, Jim. We've done the awareness, but what do they do with it? That's where the intelligence network comes in, the ability to have anonymous reporting. And by the way, as your workforce skews younger, you're going to need to make sure that you've included text reporting, or you're going to be missing information. It's not where you might have picked up a phone and left a phone message or sent an email. It needs to be text, and again, it needs to be anonymous. The putting it together, how you would do the reporting, the screening of backgrounds, the key metrics that would come in. Now tip comes in. Who's responsible for taking that within your organization? Who's doing this initial risk categorization? Is that someone in corporate security? Is it someone in safety? Is it someone in HR? Who has got that responsibility within your organization? And they do a high-level screening. I'll show you how that works in just a minute on the next slide. That information goes into a central repository where you can look at the analytics, the frequency, the severity of those elements coming in, and then an investigation done by a team within your organization. Now, when we talk about a threat management team or a behavioral management team, it's made up of a minimum of 3 people. We never want it to be the sole person's decision. Remember, they're not going to start the investigation until it's been categorized as one that's of a higher risk. And we'd include someone from the HR side, someone from the safety, security, facilities area, and finally someone from operations. In that, they would then do the screening, and then they would have an action plan, the monitoring, and you might want to think of that almost as a case management plan. Finally, there's sign-off, record keeping, and it still remains in the central repository. We worked with a company that's in the manufacturing sector, and they had an employee that was a veteran with post-traumatic stress, and he was walking on the manufacturing floor, and they have a kind of walking around above it on a mezzanine level that you can look down at it. And he was down on the main floor with his supervisor, and he said, if I put a man up in that corner and a man up in this corner, they'll have a field of fire that they can control anything that happens on the floor. The supervisor had training and recognized that this was an indicator that this is not a normal behavior, that this is a behavior of concern. They got counseling for the individual and came back and later said, you saved my life. Had there not been an intervention, I was on a path that was going to lead me in a different direction. It was a great outcome. The green box, by the way, you need all those things that you already have, HR policies and procedures. You've got to have an emergency response plan. What are we going to do if the violent act occurs? And the security assessments and plans, how secure is our building? What are our access points? What do we need to have in place? So we're not moving any of those away, but what we're focusing on here are the behaviors of concern. Even University of Alabama had earlier in the year an episode in the credit union where an individual came in a domestic-related event and held it, and as a result, subsequently there was a positive outcome. But if you look at the factor around it, there was a pattern. The pattern to control those areas. So that's the very first but going to person, then with teen action, we're going to follow our normal protocol of how we deal with it. It's protocol 911 because of concerns, or with threat management team and make that decision. If you're a multi-location organization, you might have a site team who does the investigation work but funnels it up to a corporate threat management team to make those decisions. But who gets this information? How do they go and look at it? What we're now going to do is to go into that middle bucket there where it says action, investigate, and determine how we screen that risk. Now, we're very careful with our words here because this is a risk screening. We're not forming an assessment. We're not indicating that. We're talking about what's the potential of risk associated around this individual. If the threat management team interviews the people who saw the behavior, talks to the person that was involved, does whatever other information they need to, and it's all laid out in a series of questions that they would answer that leads into a decision, and they said, I think we just kind of deal with this person, we're going to monitor it, and it's our normal supervision will work with them. That's a guarded risk. If you jump over 2 boxes to the red where it says severe, this is a situation where it's that we need help from an outside professional. We're going to suspend the employee. We're going to direct them to a psychologist or a forensic psychologist or a psychiatrist to come back and tell us that this person is no longer a risk to themselves or others before we allow them back into work. And when they come back to work, we'll have a reentry plan. We'll have how we're going to work with them, and we're going to monitor very closely. The elevated, somewhere in between the two, hey, it's more than normal, so we have to put a plan in place on how we're going to deal with them. And our goal is to hopefully we have a de-escalation of these events so it doesn't continue to carry forward. So we'll have a very detailed plan. Now, this screening team is made up, as we talked about earlier, someone from HR, someone that's covering the safety, security, or facilities area, and finally someone from operations. By the way, we still have that imminent risk there because if in the middle of the investigation you're thinking this is now going to be happening, we're back to that area where we're calling the police 911 and getting help in it. But you go through the process, put this in place, and it's all signed. So the BeRThA program gives you all of those elements built into it, and here's one of the most important things to take away. You want to do the same thing the same way every time because that reduces the probability that someone falls through the crack. It also reduces the organization's liability in that fact. So summarizing that, you see listed on the screen the awareness, the reporting, the central repository, and the plan, the investigation, the screening, the action plan, the monitoring, the sign-off, and recommendation. There is a program that we can step you through, and we'll share more details on that later, but we wanted to at least frame this, that this is how we know that those elements have been done. So you can say, can you predict this crisis? We started out talking about crisis, and the key element here is there are warning signs, and there are indicators that tell us that this is starting to happen, and that's why it becomes so very important. So yes, you can really predict a crisis. You don't have to be the next story on the nightly news about violence occurring at your location in that area. So the predictive intelligence and the social media, that may be new to you. We've talked about that in other webinars, and the term of art here is open source intelligence. 10 years ago, this wasn't available, but if someone drove by your building and took a can of spray paint and wrote on the outside of it, the building, anybody driving down the street can see that. We're not talking about hacking into somebody's account or breaking their password. We're talking about information that's out there. Social media is not random. It's targeted. There are millions and millions of postings every day, but they're about a person, a place, a thing. And so you need to understand it and identify what the target is in this seemingly chaotic world. There's some statistics here that are very interesting. 80% of the time, if someone has ill intent, somebody else knows. 67% of the time, 2 or more people know, and when people know, what do? They talk. And where do they talk? They talk on social media. So it's finally something that all those English majors can have a great career in now, looking at the semantics of speech, the syntax, the context, the idiom really makes a difference. And so designing what we can do to listen to these conversations out there, and we start to see what's happening. Think of it as a tripwire. If we see the use of this word or this phrase, it's an indicator. We set up a geofence around a warehouse for a large company, and we found a worker who made 80 postings in one 8-hour shift. Now, it would lead me to think this person was not overly productive or was bored in their job. And in fact, he was saying that in his postings, that he was bored, but he felt isolated. He felt that nobody appreciated him. They wanted him to fail. He directed his anger toward his supervisor, and finally he was making a statement that this was racial in nature. And his last statement of the day before he quit to go home was that there was only one way to solve that, and it was with a gun. And he was going to bring a gun to work tomorrow. If this was your plant, would you want to know today, or would you want to know tomorrow when he walks with that gun into the plant? That's what we're talking about listening where they are. By the way, just like in the example where I talked about finding the 17-year-old young man who was going back to the restaurant, then we can look. We can look more closely at that person, and we can look at a person, we can look at an event, we can look at a location, and we can see what was happening this week, what was happening last week, and start to put those patterns into place. So as we think about it, there are two elements here, the listen and the look, and you need to know that before now. So if you haven't filled this in as a part of your planning, and as you know, Firestorm follows a predict, plan, perform methodology. It's a way to view and to think about each of these areas. Listening and looking becomes extremely important. So some recommendations. You need a plan. It's not enough to think about an active shooter plan of, okay, what are we going to do when the guy walks through the door with the gun? And yeah, we can talk about that. But wouldn't it be better to focus on the warning signs, the behaviors of concern, how we get that information in with the reporting, doing the threat assessment that's listed, the awareness, the involvement. You want to identify support resources in your area. Do you have a forensic psychologist that you can call, or Firestorm can work with you to have a virtual assessment to help your team deal with it. Also, I'd encourage you to review your insurance, see where your coverages kick in. There are new coverages out there for deadly weapons that start to fill this gap that aren't necessarily covered under your general liability policies. You need to have an open source intelligence network, and you need to do the monitoring so you can get this information as it's occurring. And finally, you need to train everyone, and you need to test your plans. So next steps. I would encourage you to update your risk and threat assessment of your particular location. What's the access levels? What's it like during the day, at night, the lighting in the buildings? Or does the shrubbery come right up to the door so someone can hide by it and slip behind it and slip in? How is this dealt with? What do you need to put in place? Because we don't want to forget, that's another critical element here. Plans, align your crisis management plan with best practices. Develop the behavioral risk threat assessment program within your organization. And finalize how you're going to communicate with the message maps associated with it. Firestorm offers a program that we'd be glad to work with your firm on called Crisis Stop. If you find yourself in a crisis, pick up the phone and call us. You can call us 24/7, and we will help you with the decisions that you need to make. Because what we found is that the decisions that you make, the actions you take, and the words that you say in the first hour will determine whether that crisis is going to stabilize or escalate. By the way, that's a program that we can do with your organization, your association you're involved, and we're doing it with insurance companies. I would also recommend that you now do an analysis of your insurance and look at your response plans. Why don't you give them to your insurance broker and say, here's our plans, here's what we're concerned about. Please confirm that we have coverage to deal with these areas, and then stress test your plan. Firestorm conducts virtual stress tests 4 or 5 times a year, and they're at no expense. You can put put your crisis team around the table and see what it's like to make those decisions. So there is a brief. It's in. You can click on the chat area up there and get it. You can also go to the Firestorm website and download the brief that gives you a lot of the information that we've talked about today, and you can share that. I want to reach back out to Brenda. And Brenda, we need to talk about, we just missed this event at the University of Alabama. It looks like we had an old slide in our deck. And I know, by the way, if you ever get in the area and they are having their professionally speaking workshop, it's one of the largest continuing education programs there. And they're going to be holding it in Atlanta this summer on July the 12th. So if you have ever thought about this, this is a great opportunity to take and be involved. Brenda, do you want to say anything else about the University of Alabama?
Yes, in fact, I'm glad that slide is up there. We are trying to confirm our dates for professionally speaking workshops to be taken around the state of Alabama and to Atlanta and Jim's area. And we will be posting those on the website within the week. So the website address still holds as professionallyspeaking.ua.edu, and of course my contact information. It is a really good workshop that also helps people be able to garner the resources that they need in times of crisis to be able to communicate effectively, which is huge in a crisis. So coupling all this great information together and then being able to communicate it in a good way is very important. I always learn something from you, Jim, every time we do one of these webinars, and I made notes myself today on 2 or 3 things that I need to follow up on. So I hope the listeners out there were able to make a few notes. And if you have any follow-up questions, of course, Jim and I are available to answer your questions.
Thanks, Brenda. And we appreciate University of Alabama underwriting this webinar series. If you would like to watch the webinar again or other webinars, go to firestorm.com. If you've got questions, you can send us a note at webinars@firestorm.com, or you can call us at 800-321-2219. Look, we live in a world that violence is a norm, not an exception. We see it reenacted on our television daily. We see the violence in our communities. We've gone through an election that's polarizing in many respects. And all of that is leading to actions that are changing who we are and how we do things. I would encourage you to focus on the behaviors of concern within your organization. This is an area where you can make a significant difference by taking and following through these actions. I'm going to ask that we get some Firestorm principals to try to give you a call to answer questions. In the meantime, if you need help, give us a call. We're here to work with you. Thank you. Until our webinars next month, have a great week. Have a great month. Look forward to talking to you again soon. Goodbye.
Goodbye.